deep reservoir of water that supplies water all over central New Jersey. It is not a natural reservoir, but rather a man-made creation. And the following story that you're about to hear is also not natural. Some would say it is supernatural. Back behind the rope. Back behind the rope. Chester McClaw came to America in 1913, almost 100 years ago, as a young boy with his parents and older brother. They settled in Perth Amboy, New Jersey, where Chester's father worked on the docks on the Atlantic Ocean. From a family of fishermen, Chester would help his father clean the fish he brought home from work. Chester's older brother, William, was an angry and nasty boy. He would often lie to get Chester in trouble. When his parents were not home, William would pick on Chester and make him sad. A few years after they arrived in America, Chester's father died in a mysterious boating accident in the Hudson Bay. It is said that when a great storm quickly approached, Chester's dad slipped off the boat and was swept overboard. He was never heard from again. Sometimes Chester would walk along the beach and he swore he heard his father's voice. Chester! Chester! Oh, the wind would howl. Chester would run home, scared out of his wits. A year later, Chester's mother began to act strangely. She would mumble under her breath that she could hear her late husband calling her to join her in the depths below the Hudson Bay. One cold and windy night in the fall, exactly October 31st to be exact, Chester's mother disappeared. It was rumored that she walked a few blocks from her home to the ocean front, straight into the water, until she sank below the waves. Witnesses swore they heard her shout as she slipped beneath the waves. Chester! Chester! Oh, the wind would howl. At the reading of his mother's will, and to Chester's horror, William, the older son, who was really mean, was given control over the home. William, drunk with power and blaming Chester for their parents' death, made life miserable for Chester. He was forced to get up early every day and make his older brother's breakfast. Every day, Chester had to perform all these chores all around the house and was not allowed to go to school. Chester had to keep the fires burning in the winter and secure the delivery of ice in the summer for the icebox. Meanwhile, William stayed out all night long, partying with his friends and causing mischief. He would sleep late and never help out around the house. Chester was miserable as William continuously berated him. Late one night, Chester was dutifully mending one of William's socks by candlelight in his bedroom on the second floor. In the adjacent bedroom, William was fast asleep after a night on the prowl with his friends, all drunk. As he was concentrating on the sewing, Chester thought he heard through the open window that faced the bay. He thought he heard, Chester, Chester. Chester quickly got up to move to the window. As he did, he bumped into the table that held the candle, knocking it over. As the candle fell, it set fire to Chester's blanket. The fire spread quickly as Chester desperately tried to put it out, but it was no use. The fire quickly spread to the curtains, and soon the entire room was ablaze. Chester ran to his brother's room. He tried to wake him, but William was too drunk to get up. His big and by now fat older brother was too heavy to pick up. Chester tried and tried, but William wouldn't open his eyes. Finally, he smacked the older brother with all his might. William opened his eyes, finally. Enraged that Chester would strike him, yet still groggy, he screamed at Chester in a drunken slur, "You little twerp! When I get small, I'll get you." With that, William slumped back into his bed. The smoke by now was almost unbearable. Chester ran to the hallway, down the stairs, and out the back door. And for hours, he kept running. The next morning, Chester, dazed, hungry, and wet because it was raining, awoke along the side of a road in a grassy embankment. He smelled of smoke and was exhausted. A horse carriage had just driven by on the one-lane road, and the sound had startled him. Sitting up, he focused his eyes on his surroundings. It was drizzling. He was in the country. There was no one around. It was a hilly farm terrain. He guessed that he was west of Perth Amboy, very far west. A slight breeze made him shiver. In the breeze, he thought he heard his brother calling for him. Chester! Chester! Suddenly, Chester remembered what had transpired the night before, and a cold fear crept over him. He quickly got up and started running again. The sun was coming up behind him, and he decided to run west, away from the ocean, away from the smoldering ruins of his home, away from the horror his life had become. Performing all the work his brother made him do, Chester was in great physical shape. He could run like a deer. He continued to run west through midday. Finally, he came about a town. The town was Somerville, and in 1921, it was a bustling, medium-sized town that boasted the confluence of what would become State Routes 22 and 202 and 206. It was also the home of the great engine house of the Jersey Central Railroad. The Jersey Central Railroad trekked from the water's edge of Hudson Bay, near where Chester had come, west through the center of New Jersey, out towards where we are today. A narrow two-lane road paralleled the railroad through the eastern half of Hunterdon County. It was mostly farmland. To Chester, it was a beautiful new world. Yet still frightened the police would come looking for him, Chester ran along this two-lane road that would later become Route 22. He ran and he ran and he ran. At the point the railroad crossed the highway and began to snake north, Chester noticed that south of the road there was a small little town in a valley. It was a beautiful scene with little roads and farms and dozens of homes in what looked like a piece of land that was scooped out of the earth with a huge spoon. From the top of the slope, Chester looked down on Round Valley. Round Valley would later become Chester's home. He built a quaint farmhouse and soon began to farm a small plot of land. When someone would ask where he was from, he quickly replied, I came from Philadelphia, wanting his neighbors to think he'd come from the south, as opposed to being from the east, where the tragedy of his younger years was. And to Chester's relief, the high rims of the valley seemed to shield him from the whispers he used to hear in the wind. Chester. By the early 1950s, Chester McClaw had lived in Round Valley for 20 years. He'd become somewhat happy as Chester could become, but he never let that happiness show. He was still afraid the police would find him and blame him for the fire, because people really didn't know him. Most thought he was a grouchy guy and a curmudgeon. Over the years, the winds began to shift. Chester began to hear things in the winds that he hadn't heard in many years. Late at night, when the winds would whip up, Chester would hear a familiar sound coming over the ridge from the east. Chester. Chester. What Chester also heard was talk that the state of New Jersey and the federal government wanted to dam up the valley and create a reservoir. This struck anger in Chester's heart. He refused even to consider that someone would take his home away from him, and so Chester would hear none of it. "Pshaw," he would mutter out the side of his crooked mouth when folks at the general store would mention the rumor. But much to his horror, the government did have its eye on the valley. By creating 2 dams on either side of the valley, the reservoir would be created that would house over 55 million gallons of water for the people in central New Jersey. The government offered the homeowners fair market value for their homes for them to move. All the homeowners, although sad to move away, realized they were given fair value for the homes and would buy a new home in another town. All the small town residents settled with the government, packed their belongings, and moved away. All except Chester. Chester was angry. This was his home. This is where he escaped to from the nightmares of his childhood. He had put down roots here, and more than that, most people left him alone. He wasn't leaving. The authorities tried to reason with him, but he wouldn't listen. No one was going to push him around. His brother used to do that, Now it's the government. No one was going to force them to leave. No one. Now, it is a misunderstanding that no one had yet to explain. The government thought the local builder had settled with Chester, and he'd agreed to move. Meanwhile, the local builder thought the exact opposite. They thought the government had settled with Chester, and he had left with the other townfolk. In April of 1960, about 52 years ago, the construction that created the new Round Valley Reservoir was complete. Soon the workman began pumping water into the valley. Soon the water filled up the former residences of Chester and his neighbors. Chester, defiant to the end, stood his ground. Slowly but surely, the water began to rise. Soon the water covered Chester's ankles. It was cold, but Chester was determined not to give in. Then it was over his knees. His teeth began to chatter, and he soon began to turn blue. But that didn't bother him in the least. This was his home, and he would stay to the bitter end. Soon it was waist high, and before long, the water was up over Chester's shoulders. He could just barely stand, but that made him even angrier. Within an hour, the water had risen over Chester's head, and all that was left was air bubbles escaping to the surface with the faint sound of Chester's last angry grumble. Since that day, in April of 1960, fishermen and hikers from time to time are reported missing. Sometimes they would be found. Sometimes they would be lost. Forever. The legend of the ghost of Chester lives on. Like a zombie with a lost soul trapped in the depths of the reservoir, Chester struggles to find final peace in the afterlife. Because he's caught between death and final rest, his soul is tortured and searches the night air to find the person responsible for damning his beloved town and house. Beware if you fall between Chester and his search for final vindication. Rumor has it that if you happen around the reservoir after dark, much like it is right now, the ghost of Chester will capture you and use you as bait to lure the officials responsible for damning his beloved land. And so to this day, fishermen and hikers panic if they are lost as the sun is setting, much like it is now. They know the need to find their bearing and be out of the park before night falls, or face the possibility of coming face to face with Chester. Although this curse has never been proven, fishermen and visitors alike know better than to go down to the shoreline of the Round Valley Reservoir alone on a dark spring or summer night. Don't believe me? Why do you think all the park signs at Round Valley say closed at dusk? Even to this day, the officials do not want to take any chances after dark. Once the sun goes down, so do the gates at the park. Sure, it's disguised as a regular safety precaution, like in every other park. But if truth be told, regardless, if you were able to go down by the water's edge late at night, and I don't recommend that you do, you might hear a faint, very faint whisper. A voice so low it is hard to make out. A noise that is almost too faint to really hear. But if you concentrate and listen very, very carefully, almost to the point where your ear is touching the water's surface, you can hear a constant murmur. The undertone from below the undertow, whispering a desperate plea, an appeal to save the soul of its most famous resident, the reservoir's tortured soul. The name of the valley's resident ghost. The name of Chester. Chester.
I can't see them.
Aim closer to the reservoir tonight. Because I think I heard Chester.
I can't see them.